My name is Carl Meacham. I'm the director here of the Americas Program, and I am very excited for this morning's event, which is the culmination of a project that Doug Farah and I have been working on for the past year or so. Before we get started, I'm going to provide a quick rundown of how the event will go before I turn the floor over to our keynote speaker today. This morning, we'll be focusing on the themes of a report we're launching appropriately titled Alternative Governance in the Northern Triangle and Implications for U.S. Foreign Policy, Finding Logic Within Chaos, which focuses on alternative governance and transnational crime in the Northern Triangle countries of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, and dealing with the implications for U.S. security. You'll be able to find the report free as a PDF at the CSIS.org at our website. As you all know, this is a particularly important moment to be talking about crime and insecurity in the Northern Triangle. Tens of thousands of Central American children that crossed into the U.S. last year without documentation is one factor. Congress is yet to respond to this issue. There was a request for about $1 billion that the White House made to address some of these issues, but Congress has not dealt with it yet. The budget season is heating up, and the congressional window, I think, is closing because of campaign season. Some issues have been raised, some heated rhetoric by some in the campaigns have made this an issue, as well as other issues happening in the region, like the corruption scandal in Guatemala, with Otto Perez Molina stepping down because of bribery and corruption, but as well as the fact that this is an important issue. President Obama issued a determination on September 14th highlighting major drug transit countries and major drug-producing countries for fiscal year 2016, and these countries were listed on that list. So there is a lot having to do with this topic going on, but as I mentioned, there still has not been a response by the Congress. So today, we're going to dig into that, and we're going to dig into what's going on in Central America and what's been driving a lot of the problems we're seeing in the region, with corruption, with immigration, with a lack of economic opportunity. Today's session will go as follows. After I finish with my remarks, I'm going to turn the floor over to our wonderful keynote speaker, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, Karen Hollis, who's been particularly forward-leaning, on government issues and governance issues in the region. And we're really, really happy to have her with us today. It's a real treat. After Dasdi's remarks, we're going to move into our panel discussion with Doug Farah, who has really, really done an amazing job over the last year, going to an area of the region in Central America that I think very few of us would go to because of just how I'd say how dangerous it was in many ways, and he's going to give you a detailed sort of account of what he saw and the people that he spoke to, much in line with the themes, right? The alternative governance theme, and who exactly are these people in these alternative governance structures. And then we're going to have Stephen Dudley, who's the co-director of Insight Crime, also incredibly knowledgeable, very helpful in the process of going about this report, who's going to provide his reactions to the report. And then when we've had sort of this reaction to the report, we're going to engage in a conversation and then a Q&A. So on that note, I just want to remind you that this session is on the record, that we're webcasting the event live on our online platform, and good morning to everybody who's watching. During the Q&A session later on, we're going to call on you, or if we call on you, please wait for CSIS staffer to pass you a microphone then identify yourself, and then pose your question. So with that, I'm going to wrap up. I'm thrilled to introduce Karen Hollis, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Counter-Narcotics and Global Threats. She's held a wide range of positions in the Department of Defense, at the U.S. Southern Command, and at the National Security Council. She holds a master's degree from Georgetown University and a bachelor's degree from George Mason University. So I'm glad that you could join us today. And thanks again to all of you for being here. And with that, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me put this over here.
All right. And your microphone open.
My microphone works.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. First, let me thank Doug and Carl Meacham and the staff at CSIS for inviting me to be with you today. Fora like this offer great opportunities for those of us in the policy community to hear new ideas and fresh perspectives on how to address some of the most pressing international security issues that our government confronts. I would also like to congratulate Doug and Carl for putting the hours of research into this project and to write this report. Over the past couple weeks, I have had the opportunity to review and think about the findings of the report. It raises important questions about what we are seeing in Central America, especially about the relationship between transnational organized crime, the gangs, and the state. The challenges facing Central America, particularly the Northern Triangle countries of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, are particularly complex and dynamic. There are few easy answers. In just the last several weeks, we have seen the resignation and arrest of former Guatemalan President Otto Pérez Molina due to allegations of corruption, nationwide protests in Honduras calling for an end to government corruption, and a rapid increase in the homicide rate in El Salvador, all of which are bringing transnational organized crime and its role within these societies back to the forefront. I am particularly intrigued by the report's challenge to our conventional post-9/11 understanding of, quote, ungoverned spaces, end quote. I agree with the conclusion that these areas are not ungoverned, but rather they are controlled by entities other than the state. Nature abhors a vacuum. If the state is too weak to maintain control of a particular area, then another, oftentimes more malicious entity will. In the case of Central America, it has been sophisticated and ruthless transnational organized crime syndicates, which have created unwritten rules and societal norms through greed, intimidation, and outright fear. Instability in Central America does not affect only Central America. As last summer's unaccompanied minors, the alien children migration crisis demonstrated to us. It is also relevant to Mexico's efforts to improve their own domestic security, as well as the Colombian government's peace negotiations with the FARC. If we cannot help Central America address the root causes of instability, then the entire hemisphere may suffer as a result. I believe there are several factors that are responsible for the rise of transnational organized crime and violent gangs in the Northern Triangle of Central America. One is unresolved issues of corruption. Two, the technological transformations of the 21st century. And three, the lack of education and employment opportunities. The presence of these factors in countries already suffering from weak institutions contributes to grafts in the halls of power. Official corruption remains a daunting challenge, and we certainly are not immune to it in this country either. In trying to understand and address this phenomenon, we should remain mindful of the pressures that our foreign government counterparts face on a daily basis. Dr. Louise Shelley, a respected scholar on transnational organized crime, states, and I quote, "Organized crime cannot function without the corruption of officials," end quote. We have seen just in the past few weeks how corruption can undermine a government's authority and legitimacy within a society. From a distance, many governmental institutions appear to provide protections and services to their citizens, but in reality, they are often beholden to criminal groups who buy political influence. Corruption hollows out the state, corroding the essence of these institutions. As Undersecretary of State Sarah Sewell noted earlier this year at the White House Conference on Countering Violent Extremism, quote, as corruption continues, citizens become alienated and angry, causing them to lose faith in this state, or worse, fuel insurgencies and violent extremism, end quote. Loose networks of criminals now operate across international boundaries with impunity, and their actions, I would argue, are more violent, deadly, and destabilizing than ever before. Organized crime can and does co-opt government officials and elites and corrodes the legitimacy of government institutions. In some cases, criminal groups threaten and challenge states for territorial control. The staggering amount of money from drug trafficking has a corrosive impact on any institution, including the terrorist groups themselves. Groups such as the FARC in Colombia have become so dependent on drug trafficking for their operation, it becomes difficult, if not impossible, to label it as primarily a terrorist or a drug trafficking organization. In fact, it has been designated as both by my government. Elsewhere in the Western Hemisphere, drug trafficking organizations are challenging states and security forces directly, using sophisticated military weapons and tactics. These organizations are less and less like the cartels of years past, monolithic criminal organizations controlling production in all phases of business from production to sales. Instead, they are increasingly sophisticated networks of like-minded criminals with nodes in multiple countries which may be more or less dominant. These networks are multinational, adaptive entities for which international borders, laws, and customs controls are largely irrelevant, whether they traffic illicit drugs, precursor chemicals, people, or weapons. The wealth and power of these networks only exacerbates the weakness of the state, particularly in rural border regions, such as those described in this report. The corruption of state officials limits a nation's ability to develop economically and provide employment opportunities for its citizens. This, in turn, creates a vicious cycle of poverty where ordinary citizens turn to crime, gang activity, or leave the country altogether. Once these citizens become members of transnational criminal marketplace, they become incentivized to maintain the patronage networks that further undercut the state's authority. In their report, Doug and Carl unpack this codependency phenomenon by describing the relationship between corrupted state officials and transnational criminal networks as, quote, undergirding the partnership that keeps borders operating at a suboptimal level for the national interest while maximizing the benefit to both groups, end quote. Beyond the issues of corruption and inequality that continue to plague the countries of the region, changes in technology have made it easier to transport drugs, money, and people across national boundaries than ever before. I'm increasingly of the belief that national borders no longer matter. This is being demonstrated by the tragedy that is unfolding in Europe, where thousands of refugees, migrants, whatever you want to call them, mostly from Syria, are traveling across the continent in order to reach the European Union. Migrants are using social media platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and others to communicate about border closures and alternative routes. These same media means are being used by transnational criminal networks and gangs to facilitate the transportation of illicit products across national boundaries. The speed and efficiency that these technologies deliver make it even more difficult for law enforcement personnel to remain apace with these criminal actors. Finally, the lack of economic opportunities for young people is a huge contributor to the growth of gangs and transnational criminal networks in these countries. Faced with an inability to get an education and without opportunities for employment or vocational training, many youth see these organizations as their only option to earn a living. We have learned that to address these unconventional threats, we must muster tools of national power, diplomatic, development, law enforcement, and defense, to understand, track, and attack these networks as called for by the President in his 2011 strategy to combat transnational organized crime. In addition, our government is taking concrete steps to address many of the root problems that lead to instability. The President's U.S. strategy for engagement in Central America calls for a whole-of-government effort to support effective governance, economic development, and citizen security in Central America. In a big picture sense, counter-narcotics efforts serve as an excellent opportunity for collaboration. While there are often disagreements between governments on security issues, counter-narcotics cooperation is an area where we find common ground. Indeed, the Department of Defense continues to work with our interagency partners to provide support to our law enforcement partners in their efforts to strengthen the rule of law and democratic institutions in the Northern Triangle of Central America. As this report so clearly demonstrates, there are no easy solutions to the challenges Central America is facing. While the international community can provide invaluable support, the courage and resolve of officials and ordinary citizens in these countries will ultimately prevail in this struggle. I would like to close by once again thanking Doug and Carl and the rest of the CSIS team for inviting me to participate in this discussion. I think it is timely and important for the community to be having this type of dialogue, and I'm glad to be able to take part in it. You want me over here?
And with that, I'd like to invite Doug and Stephen, if you guys could come up. We're going to start the second part of today's event. So thank you, Secretary, for your wonderful remarks. And at this point, I'm going to introduce Doug and Stephen. Doug is the co-author and lead field researcher of the report we're launching today. He's a senior associate here at CSIS as well at my program, and is the president of IBI Consultants. He works as a consultant and subject matter expert on security challenges, terrorism, and transnational organized crime in Latin America, both for the U.S. government and for the private sector. He's an accomplished researcher and writer. He testifies in front of Congress. He's a good friend. I listen to his advice all the time. And on this particular project, it was a real joy to just listen to the stories when he'd come back from these very, very scary, dangerous places where he went and got the most amazing, I think, information and experiences that I think really contribute to the policymaking process. And I think we're very lucky to have been able to do this with you. So thank you, Doug. Stephen Dudley is the co-director and co-founder of Inside Crime, where he heads the group's research on Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean. Prior to his work at Inside Crime, Steve had a long career as a journalist, reporting from posts throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. Also awesome to work with him. We had these little sort of breakout sessions where we really were sort of trying to figure out what we could get out of these wonderful visits that Doug had and his interviews on site. And obviously your publication also is something that we follow, we read, and I recommend it to all of you. But right now I'm just going to open the floor to Doug. If you want to do it sitting down or from the podium, it's up to you. And then I think, Das, you, unless you have something that you want to add to your wonderful remarks, I'd go directly to Steve after Doug. Is that all right? Okay. So, Doug, the floor is yours. Great. Thank you, man.
Well, thank you, Carl, for that very generous introduction, and thank you, Dusty Hollis, for your leadership on this issue. It's been a pleasure to engage with your office in the last few years and have policymakers that are forward-looking and trying to deal with these issues. I just wanted to walk through very briefly what we were trying to do in this project when I came up with it initially, or the concept came up initially, and what the methodology was a little bit, and then open it up for comments on the project, which is certainly far from perfect, but it was an attempt to, we keep talking about alternative governance. And my feeling was we didn't really know what we were talking about. We didn't have a real understanding of what actually happened in areas where the government was either completely absent, as in much of the Honduran and Guatemalan border spaces, or where the government had become a sort of co-partner in areas like you see as the border regions, or where you had this really, I think, dangerous, unhealthy symbiotic relationships in some parts of particularly San Pedro Sula between the gangs and the police and the different types of criminal activity that are being carried out there. So we wanted to look at this, and then with Leanna, my research coordinator, and Stephen and Jill Rafferty from CSIS, we had a bunch of thinking about what we were seeing down there, and we came up with the different typologies that you'll see in the report, where we tried to look at what happens, and I looked at particularly at the town of El Paraíso in Honduras, which is right on the Guatemalan border. In 1 year, the way we were doing it, we certainly couldn't look at everything, so the little slice I chose to look at, I wanted a cross-border area, and I wanted a cross-border area where there's very little research, and I wanted a cross-border area where you could see the different phenomena sort of fully developed. So I chose a slice of the Guatemala-Honduran border to spend my time from Copan Ruinas on the Honduran side to Chiquimula and Zacapa on the Guatemalan side, and tried to look at what actually happens. How do these groups actually operate when the state is not there and someone else sort of takes control and assumes control? And so if you look at El Paraíso, where you had a very ambitious young narco mayor who had spent, his family was well known for cattle rustling and cattle movement across the border to Guatemala. When cocaine comes along as one more product, he puts it in the pipeline and moves back and forth. And the model that he developed, I think, is sort of going to be the longest lasting and most difficult to deal with, because he chose to put his money, a lot of the money, back into the town. In a way that, in some ways, comical. You'll see in the report, he built a giant replica of the White House as his mayor's office, as a big sort of screw you to the DEA, because he knew that they were looking at him. And it's this monstrous, really monstrous building there. But he also paved every road in town. He provided electricity in a town where they had never had electricity. He put cameras all over town so that there was close surveillance of everything that went on, not only so he could see if strangers like myself came in, but make sure if anybody stole a car or did something that needed corrective action, they would take it very quickly. And the consensus, and people loved him. He's since left because the DEA has been pressuring in the region a little bit, and he's moved on to parts unknown, but left his family in charge. And the other fascinating thing was that he had developed, he bought land on both sides of the border, so he could use the Pasos Ciegos, the unregistered crossings border, to go from his property to his property, which is really nice. You had other models that you see in places like La Acequia and the Chiquimula area, Ipala on the Guatemalan side, where the narcos weren't as smart, but where they exercise a really strong level of control. They don't do much for the people. Their main sort of gift to the people in the region is giving them jobs, because they own very large fincas. They also, once a year, twice a year, will generally fly in narco corrida bands, very famous bands. They'll land them in helicopters. They'll play their concerts, both for the narcos privately and then for the entire region. And then usually when the bands take off, they take suitcases of money and dump them out of the helicopter, and it blows the money all over town, and people chase it, and that's sort of their income for the next few months. But it's very less structured and very less beneficial to the people. And then, we discussed this a lot with Steve and others, putting the gangs into the project was not, it doesn't fit as neatly as it should. But I felt it was really important, one, because I had access to the gangs at the time, and I thought it was important to be able to explain a little bit about them. And second, they are an entirely different structure, a different type of dynamic that develops between areas under non-state control and the state when they sort of partner in criminal activities. And I think, to me, one of the most interesting things was looking at the border regions, where you have actually the formal border crossings, where you have this incredible bottleneck. One of the huge problems in Central American commerce is that in the European Union, freight on a truck will move about 60, 70 kilometers an hour. That's the average speed. In the United States, across the Mexican border, is about 45 miles an hour. In Central America, it's 6. That's why things don't move very well in Central America. It's an entire corrupt system in which the state partners with different organizations to maximize their profits, and in the process they choke the economic life out of the region. It was really a fascinating look. So that's why I chose that region, and then worked with Carl a lot on the policy recommendations, which I think are very strong. But the idea was to take a more granular look at what you actually see in these areas, and then try to draw some lessons from them. Nothing is cookie cutter there. Every valley is different. Every town is different. But try to draw some conclusions about what the policy implications were, and what the real weaknesses, underlying weaknesses were, and what happens when the state isn't there. Thank you.
Great. I'm going to do the policy part.
Oh yeah, sure.
Policy. Great. I mean, the way I see it is that, and I'm going to focus a little bit on the policy side, is it the most valuable aspect of the field research that Doug carried out were these case studies. It really gives insight and goes into the nuance of what these issues are that we're talking about with alternative governance structures. I sort of want to take that, and that's really, and this kind of storytelling that I think that Doug has been involved in sort of relaying some of these case studies to you, and I hope you elaborate when we get into the Q&A a little bit more, is really important in understanding what the challenges are and what this area is like. And I think that understanding these case studies enabled us to come up with our policy recommendations. Particularly my program coordinator, Jill Rafferty, and a very, very capable intern that we had, Renzo Fala, who's here, and had just finished at Harvard. They were really, really good in sort of allowing for us to come up with some innovative ways of dealing with some of these issues through the sort of policy structure. And in this, I think that the challenges really boil down to 3 points. The first one is weak governance and rule of law. The second one is poorly regulated borders. And the third is the lack of job opportunities in the formal economy. On the first, weak governance and rule of law, the case studies clearly illustrate the crisis of authority and democratic governance in the Northern Triangle. It's particularly true in border regions where the balance of power is often skewed toward non-state actors, and in urban areas where gangs have co-opted sectors of the police and asserted their dominance in specific enclaves. This important issue has fed off the federal government's weak presence in remote areas and urban centers, and it has accelerated the rise of corruption in the region. Dealing with these issues is going to take a lot of work, and what we were able to do is boil it down to two areas. One is the need to have expanded state presence in border regions. The second one is anti-corruption and pro-rule of law programs and enhancing those programs. So on the first, the U.S. government should support the improvement of transportation and communication infrastructure for the national government to easily and effectively communicate with its outer regions. By upgrading these vital elements of infrastructure, the national government would expand its reach and better fill the vacuums of power that are characteristic of many border regions. On the second point, anti-corruption and pro-rule of law, we recommend that the U.S. policy establish new and or fund the expansion of existing international commissions to fight corruption and impunity in the northern region, in the Northern Triangle. The formation of a United Nations Commission, such as the International Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala, CSIG, which was launched by the United Nations in Guatemala, would help to improve the rule of law and amplify government transparency in the region. This is especially relevant given CSIG's effort to help with the recent transition in Guatemala and Honduras, and recently moved to seek out, in Honduras had recently moved out to seek out a similar structure. On the second point, poorly regulated borders, the report's discussion of the free flow of illicit goods through both formal and informal border crossings indicates a major problem. The lack of government regulation at the regions and borders is a big issue. Given the location of the Northern Triangle at the crossroads between drug producers in South America and drug consumers in North America, this problem is of particular importance to the United States. For this issue, our recommendations are as follows. Prioritization of border control is the first issue. The second one is greater enforcement. The third is improved regional coordination. For the first, prioritization of border control, in concrete terms, the U.S. government should expand programs that train customs agents and create professional, specialized, and well-paid cadres for deployment to border crossings. Run by mainly the U.S. Custom and Border Protection CPB and the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement ICE, these programs should be prioritized and further developed to better establish background checks, increase salaries, carry out extensive training, evaluate performance to reduce corruption, and improve control at national borders. Number two, greater enforcement. The U.S. needs to launch a program that trains customs agents and creates professional, specialized and well-paid groups for deployment to border crossings. This program would resemble the formation of vetted police units that is the core component of CARSI. And number three, improved regional coordination. We recommend that the U.S. government support and encourage arbitration through the International Court of Justice. Guatemala has previously pursued the route with Belize, or mediation through or under the supervision of the OAS, with particular reference to the OAS Permanent Council. So either arbitration or mediation with an objective third party would provide a healthy forum to manage any and all border disputes to properly delineate national land borders between the Northern Triangle countries. Obviously, these are very challenging problems, but we're trying to sort of provide a structure to deal with them. And finally, on the third, the lack of job opportunities in the formal economy. The lack of opportunities for job growth in the formal economy has been one of the main drivers of gang-related violence and involvement in other illicit activities in border countries. Ultimately, it's unsurprising that weak local economies make the drug trade and other smuggling activities attractive. Job opportunities in legal trades are scarce and not nearly as lucrative. In many cases, legitimate businesses cannot compete with those that engage in illicit activities. And as narco-traffickers and gangs provide the only paying jobs in some areas, employment in these illicit activities has become culturally acceptable, further eroding any popular resistance to the omnipresence of criminality. This is, in many ways, the most protracted of the issues. It may prove the hardest to root out, but this is what we recommend. 1, economic development and prevention strategies. U.S. policy must focus on improving economic conditions and providing local citizens, especially youth, with enticing job prospects in the formal economy. Since law enforcement efforts have often proven ineffective, sometimes even promoting violence by splintering criminal groups and inciting bloody struggles for power, a development-first approach would avoid intensifying internal violence and would strip gangs and traffickers of their primary recruiting tool, which is offering newcomers a decent wage. And in specific response to the increasing power of gangs in urban environments, we recommend supporting measures that focus on crime prevention and rehabilitation, as well as security-focused measures. And number 2, clarity of goals and results. In developing its policies, the U.S. government needs to ensure that its economic development projects are closely monitored in order to achieve sustained success. One of the biggest drawbacks of CARSI, for instance, remains that with the exception of the U.S. Agency for International Development, crime and violence prevention program impact evaluations were not carried out, at least not as publicly available data. So we recommend that the U.S. develop efforts in the Northern Triangle and announce quantifiable goals, establish clear metrics for measuring ongoing progress, and review programs at regular intervals. I think this last issue is particularly important right now. There's discourse going on in the campaigns, and I think a lot of folks are targeting a lot of these issues right now. And I think initially we had even talked a little bit, I think I talked with Stephen, I think I might have even mentioned this to Doug, that a lot of the people are coming to the United States because they're escaping violence, because they're escaping horrible situations in their countries, not because of choice in many situations. So in these discussions, we often talk about push and pull factors that increase the likelihood of people coming into this country. I think that this is a factor that we need to really focus on. Not creating the need for people to have to come to the United States, but also enhancing opportunities in their countries of origin so that they stay in their countries of origin is also important in this policy. So I think those are the issues. I tried to go as quickly as I could. I had a lot to talk about there on the policy side, but hopefully this is helpful, and if you have any questions in the Q&A, I look forward to answering them. Steve, you're up.
Thanks. Thank you.
Sure.
All mic'd up. I feel like I've been holding my breath for the last 40 minutes. Good morning. Thanks a lot to CSIS, of course, Carl and Doug for doing this excellent report. And just for, this sort of constant struggle that it is to understand what is this logic within chaos, and that's certainly the challenge that we're in at Inside Crime. I think that's what I'll kind of try and take on the logic within this chaos. And I guess one of the things I would mention is this comes at an opportune time for us and for me in particular. We just finished a report on gangs in Honduras, which we are anxious to publish. We're just waiting for clearance from the funders. We also are finishing up what is now a 3-year study on elites and organized crime in Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Colombia. So we'll be anxious to release those reports as well. There'll be a series of 8 case studies in the 4 different places. And as we're gearing up to this is sort of a perfect intro to talk about these 2 subjects, almost exactly what we were doing. I'm going to go in reverse order from what the report actually does, and talk about what I think is the unifying feature. If we were to try to find logic within the chaos, which is obviously difficult, if not impossible, I guess the thing for me that stands out the most and is most important is this idea of criminal economy. And specifically, within this idea of criminal economy, the idea of what type of criminal group we are talking about. And that is, for me anyway, the determining factor in the relationship between the communities and the politicians and those around them. In other words, their social atmosphere. First, if we look, for example, at the gangs and at their criminal economy, and we go even a layer deeper than some reports have done for sure, but something that we found in our research in Honduras was the difference between the MS-13 and the 18th Street Gang as it relates to extortion. And can you then measure which one would be, as Peter Lupsha would call, more predatory versus one that is much more sort of transactional or service-oriented? And as we look closer into that, what we found was the MS-13 had a policy that they would not extort in their areas of operation. This is incredibly important for their relationship to the community, for their relationship to the police as well. There's certainly much less of a problem to the police. They're much more sort of to and fro with the community as well. So this is very, very important. Part of this comes from the other aspect, a very important aspect of their criminal economy, which is that they're increasingly focused on controlling the local drug trafficking market. Mostly drug peddling at this stage, but also to the point where we've seen them try to take over and perhaps even take over the sort of mayorista market, the market where they're controlling the wholesale distribution. And this would be the market that would bring them in closest proximity with some of the larger, what Doug and others we've called transportista networks. And so this is very important because this makes it so they do not have to extort in their areas of operation. They are less dependent on that criminal economy in order to survive. So they can have a different relationship with their community. And that also is very important because they not only do not extort their neighbors, the small shopkeepers and those in their areas of influence, but they can say with confidence, or at least they can say and they can put out an image that they are protecting them from the others who might come and extort them and be much worse. In this case, mostly the 18th Street, but there are a number of other organizations, street gang level organizations in Honduras that live off of extortion that people would fear and they wouldn't want. The most famous of them is one called the Chorizos. It's sort of an offshoot of an old drug peddling network. But this is very important, and there's actually an ongoing war right now between the Chorizos and the MS-13 over an area called Los Mercados. And what they do say is that we are protecting you. And one particularly famous case was this idea of the MS-13 was going after women with blonde hair. And what people said was, oh, well, look at them. They're going after willy-nilly women with blonde hair. As it turns out, the Chorizos women who were collecting the extortion were they often had blonde hair. They dyed their hair blonde. So the message maybe to the outside world was that they were going after these sort of blonde-haired women. But internally, what they were saying was, we are protecting you from these blonde-haired women. So you could see how our interpretations would differ greatly depending upon what the message was that they were trying to send and how they could actually send it. So that would be the first thing I would point out with regards to the gangs. And it's very difficult to connect, as Doug pointed out, you're going to connect the gangs to these sort of larger transportista networks, which is what the report actually tries to do. But I would connect it in the same way, the idea of criminal economy, and not in the broader sense, because in the specifics of how this works, it does work slightly different. And I think the transportista networks, more than anything else, have tried to integrate themselves into what is both a political and a business economy. And I'll get to it in a minute, but the idea of us trying to extract them from that business and political economy is very difficult. And I think that's where we run into a lot of problems when we try to inject our policy prescriptions in these areas. This is most clearly manifested, this relationship, in the sort of what I would call the merry-go-round of public works projects. This is the most important aspect for us, from what we can see from our studies in the region with regards, it's both sort of an indicator and a result of what's happened. What do I mean by that? I mean that the region as a whole has gone through a period of incredible political and economic decentralization. What you see on the ground level in places like El Paraíso is a result of this incredible transformation, which really began in the 80s, if you want to go back that far, but certainly in the 90s. So the locals, mayors in particular, but also the congressmen, or what they call deputies there, have increasing power. They are increasingly the sort of node through which a lot of business is taking place, and not just any business, but state business. And state business isn't just any business, but it's a business that has been rising over the years. Just to give you one example, the GDP in Honduras, the government business, their representation of the GDP in Honduras in 1980 was 16%, and now it's 22%. So we see a shift in how much business is being done through the state. And so these local interlocutors or nodes that can control these transactions become incredibly important. And we can see an immediate impact with that. In Guatemala, to move to the Guatemala example, the number of local construction companies and construction companies in general in the late 1990s was in the range of 80, 85. Now you have over 2,000 construction companies that are starting to vie for these particular contracts, for these road building contracts. A lot of these companies, can't put a number on it, are controlled by local criminal interests who create what I would call this merry-go-round. They create a situation in which they get some protection because of their connections to politicians. They can then pay for some of that protection with campaign contributions. The politicians can then even return the favor further by providing them and their companies with contracts. So you create a sort of never-ending merry-go-round in which these local players, like Alexander Ardon become incredibly important players and almost move to a par with your local drug traffickers, or they are the drug traffickers. One step even more important to this process, and in this way I would differ from the report, is the necessity of these particular groups to have some sort of connections at the highest levels. The report argues that they don't aspire to be sort of national level politicians, and I would agree with that. But I do think that they need a national level political connection in order for them to continue to operate. The case of Alexander Ardon is in fact his brother. His brother was the head of what's called the Fondo Vial in Honduras for 4 or 5 years, right, Doug?
Yeah.
And his name is Hugo Ardon, and obviously he's the guy who is running the highway institute, if you will, the Fondo Vial. So he's the guy who's controlling these interactions, incredibly important node in this construction of this merry-go-round. But not just that. He ran the campaign for the current president in the western part of Honduras for Juan Orlando Hernandez. So he's a very important person politically. And lo and behold, when we see the Honduran government going after some of these very large transport networks, the only one that has yet to be touched thus far is the Ardon network. Now, I don't know if that's coincident or not, but I just posit that as a possibility. Lastly, and I would just leave it here, just a couple ideas about the state, our notion of the state. It's very important for us as Westerners to understand what the state is, but it's actually an incredibly difficult, if not impossible, thing to define. We spend a lot of time trying to do it, and I don't think with a lot of great success. And I think in part of that is because we think of this idea that it's just sort of this actual physical structure, this sort of, heaping body of concrete or something that's impenetrable, and either you're on the inside or you're on the outside. When actually, in reality, it is so much more fluid than that. And what we think of the state, I think, on a local level, which is what they're talking about, what we should be thinking about is just who is fulfilling their hierarchy of needs. And whoever that is, that's the state. And I think definitely we're moving in that direction with regards to the report. But I think that we need to be even sort of almost more flexible than we are, and think about these things as sort of when we construct a society, we're constructing all parts of society at the same time. We're not sort of constructing this bit here and then we add this bit here. It's not a building, what we're constructing. We're constructing something that is more like an amoeba. It's definitely something that is much more permeable or less permeable than this. It's just something that can change over time, and that our understanding and our relationship to it can change over time. And I think that that's very important to consider as we consider how these particular groups operate in these areas. I would just leave it there. Thanks.
Great. So now we go into sort of the non-talking points part of our event here. I'm going to start with Doug, and I just, I want to give you sort of all of the credit due with these case studies, and I want to sort of get your views on what surprised you the most during your trips. Was there something that came out as being very different from the visits that you had? Elaborate a little bit about that.
Well, I had never looked at the formal border crossings before as sort of nodes of problems. And I think that Steve expressed really well just now something that I probably didn't say as explicitly as would have been useful in the report, and that is the idea that you have this organic thing happening. We like to call that we want it to be the state or the non-state. And so much comes down to legitimacy. I mean, the legitimate person in the El Paraíso situation is the Ardon family, because the state's never been there, and these guys have actually provided. And it's not that people feel coerced, although I'm sure some do, because when you control the merry-go-round of public works and who gets hired there, and the land all around and who gets hired there, and your municipality and who gets hired there, you do have a great deal of control over how people, whether people are going to like you or not, because you need jobs. But there is also a genuine affection for someone who came in and did something that no one had ever done before. And I think at the policy level, that's very difficult to deal with, because we understand them as illegitimate actors or actors that need to be pursued. And on the ground level, that's totally contrary to what the people feel should be done, right? They'd like Alex to come back and reassume the alcaldía and make, get on the merry-go-round again. So I think that sort of the deeper understanding of how that relationship was very helpful. And I think with the gangs, I think that it's just such a fluid situation right now that and you have the MS really pushing the 18 out, and you have these new groups, the chorizos and folks emerging, and it's just a time of chaos. And to think we know, at least I think that any of us who think we know where that's going are severely misguided, because I think they're in an entirely different phase where they themselves have no idea how it's going to end. I don't think they know how they're going to end up with their relationship with the transportistas, among each other, with the state. And in some ways it's fascinating, in some ways it's really terrifying. And I think that as you watch them morph into this constantly more evolved type of structure, and as they go forward, I think certainty is really bad, but I think the only thing I'm fairly confident is it's going to get a lot worse. And I think that was sort of my takeaway from that time.
And Des D. There's a lot that has been said, and I would sort of, like to know your reaction to the things that have been said, but also sort of get your reaction to some of these policy recommendations and see if those things are consistent with what you're doing, or maybe there's certain things that you feel that need to be acknowledged that haven't been acknowledged, or what. I mean, the focus of what we talk about in the report is, we've got to deal with weak governance and rule of law, poorly regulated borders, the lack of job opportunities in the formal economy. What's your reaction to that?
Well, thank you, Carl.
Sure.
I do feel that there's the president's new strategy for central engagement in Central America is addressing many of the things that you have proposed. It is looking at citizen security, specialized neighborhoods, looking at providing this the rule of law, doing all sorts of activities that I think will address many of your concerns. And I think that it's a robust program, it's a well-thought program, and I'm really pretty excited about it. I think it's going to be effective. I'm particularly intrigued with Stephen's characterization of the state as an amoeba, because I think that really is visually, it does address a lot of the questions I have about how the people roll in and out of the state, and the state does not have the effect that we like to think we have here in this country. It's very interesting.
And Stephen, you've done a lot on these issues for a long time. How does the work that we did in our report overlap with yours, and the case studies that Doug was able to do overlap with a lot of the work that you've done?
Well, I think in some of the ways that I expressed. I mean, this certainly the subject matter, gangs, and also political influence at the highest level. We haven't necessarily taken apart a mayor yet, so I think that is fascinating and great added value. We thought about going, and doing some of that work. We ended up doing some other type of work, but I think in general terms, the value is kind of scratching away at what we're just talking about. What is actually the state in these areas? What does that mean to these people? And as you start to scratch away, what you see is, okay, you got number one is security, physical security. Number two would certainly be, are they providing some sort of economic motor or engine to the area? And you can see that when they get arrested, you will get immediate, marches and protests and things of that sort, calls so that they don't get extradited and things of that sort. So I think that we need to think about it in those terms, and how is it that you present how is it that the United States government and their partners present alternatives to these aspects, and based on that idea of a hierarchy of needs. And I think that the number one thing is, it always comes back to, at least in this region right now as we speak, is physical security. And so if the U.S. is going to plow hundreds of millions of dollars in the area, shouldn't we be thinking mostly about physical security? But then doesn't that fall short on your list of recommendations, which has to do with, over the long term, you have to tackle these other questions. Is that the United States job? I'm not sure. And when you lay out also just one last thing, just this idea of CARSI and the amount of money that CARSI has put in, if you break that down by year and by country, we're not talking about a lot of money. In fact, we're talking about between $15 and $20 million a country over that period of time per year. That is what the CSIG's budget is. The CSIG's budget is $12 to $15 million a year. So all you're going to do then with that money is put a CSIG in every single one of these countries. That is not exactly what I would say is the right course of action.
Okay. I'm going to open it up to the audience a little bit. I know that there's a lot of questions. So why don't we're going to start up here, up front. If we can get a microphone up here. And then we're going to work our way back. All right.
Good morning. My name is Mick Anderson. I had a question. I didn't hear the issue of indigenous peoples in the region being addressed. And I think that that's fundamental because so often people will talk occasionally about it, but they don't do much. And why is that important? Because, for example, when fighting gangs, one of the things that's not really looked at is self-identity. And the fact that a lot of the people who go into gangs are former people whose parents used to consider themselves indigenous, but when they went to the cities, they become kind of what they used to say in the day, lumpen proletariat, and they don't have a place to go, and they're looking with something to identify with. Furthermore, the alternative structures that the United States has to offer, particularly in terms of tribal courts, the Navajo Nation has the world's largest tribal court in the world, and it functions very well. You have reservations. We talk about our extending a hand in Central America, but very little of that is done working with tribal peoples of the United States to go there and talk brother to brother, so to speak, or sister to sister, about what the needs of indigenous peoples are. I could go on, I don't want to make a speech, but how do you think that fits in to, particularly with the president's new policy, what is going to be done? Because something obviously, I know in one DoD program where they've trained maybe 4,000 people over the last 10 years, and there's less than 12 people that you could actually say are indigenous. Well, indigenous peoples are 10% of the population in the region. I think that's very important.
Was there any issue having to do with indigenous folks when you were in the different places that you went, Doug?
No, I mean, Honduras, I didn't find anyone who self-identified as indigenous, and certainly in the gangs, and certainly not in the border region. There was not a self-identification that came up. When you get up a little bit further north into the Guatemala side of the Salvador region, where there's a lot of interaction between drug trafficking and indigenous communities, and where the indigenous communities are very close to outsiders, and where it's very difficult for either to get information or to get the indigenous communities to cooperate because of the long histories of abuses and other things. That I think would be a lot more relevant. I think on the particular border region from Ipala across into Copan, there's not my sense, I didn't ask people this, so I don't know, but no one, certainly in the gangs, never self-identified as indigenous. They identified as primarily MS or 18, and secondarily or in a tertiary way as a citizen of that country, but their primary identification is very, very strongly the gang, which I think is one of the issues you get into with the transnational nature of or the multinational nature of the gangs, is that they view themselves so entirely as other, and so entirely as their primary identification as gangs and not as a nationality, that it's a real challenge. But I didn't come across that in a huge way. I don't know, Steve.
No, and it's obviously incredibly complex, and you've got numerous different indigenous groups as well when you're talking about a place like Guatemala. So it's very complex to mix into this, and especially when they're, I don't know, I think this is short-sighted at this point. It certainly warrants much more sort of direct investigation. But certainly what we found is that they're as marginalized or more in many of these instances. And, really in the instances that we've seen them become involved, it's that they're in very remote places like the Mosquitia area of Honduras and Nicaragua, where you see a sort of proliferation of activity over the last decade or so, and they're used. They're largely used, by these larger operations. But I can't go much further than that.
The questions over here. Here.
Thank you. Richard Downey from Delphi Strategic Consulting, and thanks for great discussion. One of the decisions that the countries of the Northern Triangle have made is to use militaries as either in support of police, or in some cases in place of police, using police powers. And Karen, you mentioned this issue briefly in your remarks. I wonder if you could clarify the DoD position on how this is practiced, or how you are supporting these efforts. And Doug and Stephen, I'd really like to know how you guys are seeing this on the ground, how it's being carried out, how it's been effective or not. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Richard. I think the DoD role and DoD position is that we provide support to law enforcement. We do not perform law enforcement. Many of these nation states have felt that they have to use their law enforcement. I've had conversations with with Salvadorans and others who have always paired the law enforcement with their militaries when they're doing patrols, so they have arrest authority. It's a very, very sensitive and complicated matter. We all appreciate the fact that this is a law enforcement function. To police is not a military function. However, there are times when nation states are called upon to do things that they're not really trained to do, such as a PMOP in Guatemala. And I think we see that these activities are sensitive. We are very conscious of the militarization of policing, and so we try to stay away from that. We provide training and support to law enforcement through my authorities, but we do not encourage the policing by military.
I think it's, as Dasti said, it's quite complicated, because I think, you look at in Honduras, and the reason they bring in the Policía Militar is because it was recognition that their police force was a complete and utter disaster. Now, which it is, but does that mean that the Policía Militar will be less of a disaster? It's an open question. In fact, there's a lot of feeling already that they are as big, or perhaps a bigger disaster in terms of use of lethal force and the lack of training, et cetera, et cetera. I think that there is this, and I understand. I grew up in Bolivia. I lived under military dictatorships most of my life, and I have no fondness for bringing the military back into these type of functions. I think, and the question that I've wrestled with is, can you really do it on a temporary basis where you could train the military in certain tactics and then have them actually leave those tactics when the society termed that? I'm not sure it's possible. I think in an ideal world that one might aspire to that, because the police can't do it. They just can't do it. I mean, when you look at El Salvador, where particularly the MS is now trained up as military units and carry out very sophisticated ambushes and target not just random shoot-bys of police and military, but particular hits on particular people with training camps, all of those things, the police can't do that. They cannot tackle that issue. Do you want to bring the military out? No. Do you have any option? Probably not. And so I'm not in favor of it on a visceral level at all. I think in reality, if you can do it in a way that they would be forced back to the barracks very quickly at a certain juncture when things were met, perhaps, but it's difficult.
Just very quickly, I think the reality is what Doug is saying. I mean, at a visceral level, the reaction is, no way. But the reality on the ground says you need to somehow create some sort of Band-Aid, stopgap, whatever you want to say. The question for me is, what controls do you have in place? What sort of regulatory bodies and oversight bodies and other sort of institutions or outside institutions do you have in place to monitor what's happening? And then the second question is, what is your short, medium, and long-term plan to phase out the use of the military? And when you don't see either of those, I think huge red flags should be going up. And that's what we're seeing in the region. We don't, or that's what we're not seeing in the region. We don't see those things, and until we do, then we can't really take a step back and feel very comfortable about the military intervention.
Let me go on this side. If you get a microphone up here.
Thank you. I'm Adam Isaacson from WOLA. My question really is about the Obama administration back in February put out a proposal for $1 billion in assistance. Dasdi Hollis mentioned it, and well, actually, I applaud your interagency spirit there, because there's no additional money in that proposal for the programs you oversee. So good. I'm glad you did that. But obviously, that program has been whacked back very deeply in Congress. Nonetheless, looking at what the Obama administration proposed, and the recommendations that come out in your new report, which I haven't seen, how do they overlap? What is the Obama administration missing in the additional programs they're proposing, and what initiatives that they're proposing would you applaud? How does it overlap, basically?
I think they're consistent. I think one area where we probably focus a lot on is the borders and regulating the borders, and the importance of dealing with transit points in a different way. I think the other issue is the economic imperative. One of the big reasons that people are coming to this country, and I'll repeat it, is because they don't have, well, one is the issues of security that we've highlighted. The other ones are the issues that have to do with jobs and opportunities. And I'll go right to what I mentioned to you, Stephen, a little bit at the beginning, is that because of the violence, because of the horrible situation, the corruption, lack of belief in the governments that govern these countries or don't, or enrich themselves from these countries in many cases. Are these folks just migrants, or are they refugees? I mean, I think there's a lot of issues there that need to be dealt with. I don't expect you to say anything. I don't want you to get in trouble. But I think there's a lot of, there's a discussion that needs to be had in that regard. But I would say that we probably focus or emphasize a little bit, taking from Doug's experience when he was in these areas, poorly regulated borders, there needs to be a way of dealing with that, both for safety, transit of goods, licit and illicit. And you see the case in Guatemala, how the president was benefiting himself from a lot of these areas of transit, right? He was getting money directly from this. And then the issue of lack of opportunities in these countries. How does the U.S. government become a constructive force in the creation of employment in these countries? I think those would be the two areas. Yep. We'll go back to this side, the gentleman in front.
Hi, I'm Jeff Bryce. I'm at Johns Hopkins SISE and once a colleague of Karen's at the Defense Department. Picking up on your point about economic empowerment, obviously the security and the economic have very strong dependencies, and one of the keys is to develop the legitimate alternative to the business that drives these challenges from the criminal side. So I had three questions, three topics about which the United States has some influence. And I wanted to get your thoughts or reactions on these as tools. One is CAFTA. Okay, this has been described by some, it's supposed to be a regional integration pact as well as one that brings the United States in. Some people describe this as a series of bilateral trade agreements with the United States, and we haven't done enough, or not enough has been done to integrate the Central American market, and I think that's been touched on. Second is foreign direct investment. American investment is sometimes deterred by the rule of law issues, not so much security as corruption. But at the same time, American investment comes with transparency, Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. So investment from overseas can improve the rule of law environment. I wonder if there's ways we can encourage that. And third, grassroots investment. This is another area where the United States and other Western countries have taken an interest. For instance, women's economic empowerment is an alternative that can strengthen more legitimate alternatives to the kind of malign structures that you described. So that's a lot, but I wonder if the panelists could talk about those or some of those.
Do you want to start? Or?
I'll let Dusty start.
Well, I think those are very interesting ideas, Jeff. And it's good to see you. I think that as we look at how we're going to do the economic empowerment within the small communities and within Central America, it's important for us to recognize that these bilateral agreements do exist and the empowerment issues are there. I think that it's a struggle because we do have a lot of restrictions and corruption is a grave concern. But we are trying to rationalize the programs in such a way that we can avoid dealing with corrupt influences and to provide the investment so that we can empower the citizens of Central America.
To me, the fundamental issue, and something that Dusty touched on earlier, is corruption. I mean, if you look at the documented corruption from the Arena governments to the FMLN governments in El Salvador, coupled with Otto Perez Molina and what we know about Honduras, it's well over $1 billion. And so the idea that somehow we need to come riding to the rescue with huge amounts of money until that situation is cleared up, I think is nonsense. I think if corruption were halved, they would have more than enough money to fund whatever we want to do, and they would draw in foreign direct investment, and you'd have the situation which I think you're seeing now coming to fruition a bit in Guatemala, where you have frustration the anger is so deep at the utter incompetence and absolutely rampant corruption that people finally take to the streets and they finally get an action. My question in that situation and looking at Honduras is whether the resulting changes will be of any sort of permanent nature or whether the old guard will simply close ranks and lock down whoever emerges as president and refuse to allow any sort of real change, which I think is a real possibility. So I'm not overly optimistic that you'll have true change, but I think that the demonstration, and I think this is why we're not going to see a CSIG in Honduras and El Salvador, is the demonstration that the CSIG did an incredible job. Things happened, and a president fell, and a vice president fell, and nobody else is going to let that happen in their country, right? It's like, oh, okay, we see what a CSIG could actually do. So I think that the broader issues that go to the grassroots investment, and especially foreign direct investment, entirely center on the ability of these countries to begin to deal with their own internal corruption issues.
No, and I would just add to what you're saying. I think what you're both saying is incredibly important, but there are opportunities that we've engaged in the past of matching up producers of goods, that being small and medium-sized business folks in country, with multinational corporations here, which have been operated by USAID. And the example that I remember very clearly is an agricultural cooperative in Guatemala run by women that had a market or a matched market with Walmart. And we have been very good in the past when people want to be creative and people want to do these public-private partnerships. You actually can do these things, and I think it's important that we continue doing those things. But the issues, I mean, it's just going to be a drop in the bucket if you don't deal with the larger issues that both Doug and the DASD have mentioned here during the presentation. Let's get someone. So we've gone to this side, now we have to go to this side. So let's.
Hi, I'm Zoe Ryder. I'm with Transparency International, and I work in the Americas department closely with our Northern Triangle chapters. I was just going to mention that we're actually here this week because we're very concerned about the $1 billion that may or not be spent and how it's going to be spent. And it's really critical for our chapters that that money, however, whether it's going to economic development or security, that it has those critical matrices of indicators. The impact reports are there, and that the security institutions that might get funded are also funded for much more intently on strong transparency and accountability mechanisms, which I think is where you're trying to go with the president's policy, which is great. But I'm listening to all of this, and I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about where you see the Alliance for Prosperity going, because that's not actually being funded really by the United States. That's, in theory, coming from lots more money from elsewhere, and that's going to go into the region. And so the critical aspects that you're talking about can really be exacerbated if we have billions and billions of dollars going into the region through these national state actors who are connected to local state actors who are connected to traffickers. So to what degree are you addressing that in Washington, D.C.? I'm based in Berlin, so I'm curious. And where do you see that going in the next 6 months to a year?
Who wants to take a stab at it?
I think that there is a much higher level of awareness of the need for transparency now, and I think that in discussions with folks in the Northern Triangle, I think the object lesson in Guatemala could be very useful across the region. And it was, as Carl noted, it was directly tied to the borders. It was directly tied to bringing stuff across borders. So if you're going to pump money into these countries, there has to be, and I think everyone agrees. Now, what those mechanisms are at a USG level, I don't know, or at the EU level, or the other funding organization, or the funding groups are. But I think that everyone agrees there has to be some. And I think that there is a strong feeling that a lot of money has gone in and very little has come out in the past. And I think that the real sort of pressure point here, the thing that exists that maybe didn't exist in the not too distant past, is the public outrage at the corruption. There's a strong awareness that this is happening. There's a very strong calls for accountability. How those translate out in the different societies, I think, is up for grabs. I like to say I'm not overly optimistic you're going to see sweeping transparency come to Guatemala now that you got rid of Otto Perez and Roxana. But I do think that it's going to scare the crap out of the next people that come along. And I think that's incredibly healthy. And so I think that if we think about it, and I think the USG is, and I think AID is putting a lot more thought into this. I don't deal much with the European Union, so I don't, maybe Stephen does. But I think there is a greater awareness of the need to include those mechanisms, even though it costs a little bit in the project to do, and people are reluctant to put those resources aside for that. I think ultimately, if you want to have any faith restored in the ability of governments to govern, they have to do it. But how that will play out, I'm not sure.
Just real quick, I think the word that everyone's avoiding is conditionality. I have spoken to a lot of people about this with regards to Honduras, for example. And all the officials that I spoke to on the U.S. side about this hate it. They hate this idea of conditionality. It's incredibly difficult to implement conditionality for multiple reasons, super complex, multi-layered. We can do an entire panel on conditionality if we wanted to. I think what I've seen work is maybe conditionality for me, maybe is the wrong word. Maybe we should be talking about flexibility. Maybe we should talk about the idea of putting in points in which you check progress or not. Creating maybe the reform is as much on their side as it is on our side with regards to how we implement these projects. And I think that is also an aspect that we need to fully embrace, that perhaps we need to think about more flexible means of intervention rather than these rigid bureaucratic means of intervention, which are what I think hamstring a lot of different actors in the process and almost make it impossible to create conditionality. So I would push the debate on both sides of the fence.
Margaret Daly Hayes right here.
Thank you. I'm Margaret Daly Hayes. And, I got interested in this problem of Central America on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee when we were going to war down there. And I'm now teaching security studies at Georgetown. I've been perplexed in your presentations, and particularly on the discussion of governance. I don't think I heard once a mention of an authority or groups that want the kind of change and the kind of projects that you were discussing. And if we don't have actors in the countries who own the change process and the vision and work to define the projects, I don't think we're going to see any progress at all. So did you find people who are enthusiastic about change, perhaps reacting to the outrage over corruption around here and so forth? And do we have a base to build on in these different countries?
Well, I think in every country that I deal in, there are small groups of people who really desperately want change, and a great mass of the political status quo that doesn't. That's why I'm not optimistic about Guatemala. I think that even despite this rather remarkable turn of events, it doesn't guarantee that you'll have anything going on. And Dasti and I have talked about this in the past. The number of trusted interlocutors that want change and that we could trust with money to implement it in ways that, even if, I'm not saying ways that we like in terms of policy, in ways that we would find where the accountability is, where the money actually is spent on other things, are very few. And I think it is an enormous problem in the region in which you have largely become, where almost everything has become transactional. Justice has become transactional. Whoever can pay for their verdict will get their verdict. Whoever can pave with the gangs will get the gangs' vote. Whoever can do almost anything is transactional. And I think that that is entirely destructive of the rule of law and the concept of what we would consider to be good governance. And so I think that's a really valid question. I think that one really has to go back a bit to the transparency thing. Who are you dealing with, and is there any will to implement anything other than the status quo? And I think that in a lot of cases the verdict is not overly positive.
I think it changes. I think last year, I'll give you a specific example. I think last year the way people looked at Thelma Aldana, who is the Attorney General of Guatemala, was largely negative. The belief was that she was part of this cadre of corrupt officials, Roxana Baldetti, President Otto Perez Molina among them, and that she was their selection for Attorney General. As it turned out, she is a dynamic character, perhaps much more trustworthy than people presumed at the start, and has turned out to be a pretty important agent of change, even if she hasn't yet sort of assumed the mantle that the CICIG has right now. So I think these things are dynamic. I don't think that we can necessarily say that this is a person and this is the way the person's going to be over a long period of time. I think that people can be taken and they can be worked with, and what you may think is sort of a negative actor may turn out to be a positive actor. So I would keep that in mind as well.
And I think that what we see, there are leaders in each of the countries that are coming out. They're coming out in support of the Alliance for Prosperity. They have made progress trying to look at and resolve issues, and they're deeply, deeply committed to making change. I think that we can't look at it all as a corrosive nature. There are in each individual country agents of change. And as we saw in Colombia, where, as you recall, in the late 80s, we thought there was no hope, and the Colombians came back together and took back their country. So I think there are positive aspects here, and I do believe that we will make progress over the coming months.
I think on that note, we're gonna wrap up. Dasti, you've been incredibly generous with your time. Doug, thank you. It was great to work with you. Stephen, and the name of the publication is Alternative Governance in the Northern Triangle and Implications for U.S. Foreign Policy, Finding Logic Within the Chaos, and you can find it at csis.org. Thank you very much for coming.